The evening sun cast a golden glow through the grand windows of the Hartford estate, highlighting the exquisite taste of its furnishings and the grandeur that surrounded Victor Hartford. Seated at the head of a long, polished dining table, he watched his daughter Lily, her eyes downcast, fiddling nervously with the edge of her napkin. The silence between them was thick, charged with tension that had been building for weeks. At 28, Lily had blossomed into a woman of beauty and intelligence, and yet her father saw her as little more than a pawn in his meticulously planned world. Victor's mind had always been one to navigate through control, power, and influence, the qualities that had driven him to wealth. He had no room for feelings or soft ideals like love. His approach to life was simple. Everything could be bought, everything could be manipulated. He had arranged for Lily to marry James Bradley, a man who matched her station, wealthy, well-connected, and established in society. He was the perfect suitor, a man who would secure Lily's future in the way Victor had always envisioned for his daughter. But Lily had other ideas. Her heart had already been claimed, not by the polished, well-to-do James, but by David, a farmer from the nearby Maple Ridge. Theirs was a love that had flourished quietly, away from the eyes of her father, but now the truth was unavoidable. Her love for David was real, pure, and deep, and Lily could no longer pretend it was not. She had tried to ignore it, to conform to the expectations of her father, but each passing day, the weight of her own feelings had grown unbearable. Tonight, as Victor laid out his plan for her future, Lily could feel the walls of the estate closing in. She had hoped, desperately, that her father might understand, that he might see that love could be enough. But Victor's cold gaze told her everything she needed to know. There was no room for weakness in his world, no room for emotions that could not be quantified. His voice, steady and unyielding, broke the silence. "You will marry James Bradley, Lily." Victor's voice was like iron, his words precise. "This is your duty. This is what I have arranged for you. He is a man of wealth, position, and honor. He will ensure your future is secured." Lily's heart pounded as she lifted her gaze to meet her father's eyes. It was not anger she felt, but something deeper, disappointment, heartbreak. She opened her mouth to speak, but found that the words wouldn't come. The years of being molded by her father's expectations left her with little room for defiance. And yet, as she thought of David, his quiet strength, his unwavering love, she knew she couldn't betray her heart. "I can't," she finally managed, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't marry James. I've already made my choice." Victor's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Your choice?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "And what exactly do you call this foolishness? This infatuation with that farmer?" Lily's chest tightened as the truth hung in the air between them. Her heart ached as she looked at her father, the man who had given her everything, except the one thing she truly needed, the freedom to choose for herself. She stood, her hands shaking as she gripped the back of the chair. "I love David," she said, each word feeling like a weight lifted from her shoulders. "I want to be with him. He's not wealthy, but he has a heart full of love, and that's enough for me." Victor's face darkened, his jaw clenched in fury. For a long moment, he said nothing, only stared at her as if she had just committed the most unforgivable crime. His eyes flashed with the kind of rage that had become familiar over the years, the kind that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what he wanted, and seeing no reason why things should change. "You will choose, Lily." Victor's voice was icy now, devoid of emotion. "You either marry James, as I have arranged, or you leave this house. Leave everything behind and go with him. But know this, you will be disowned. Your life here will be over." Lily's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. Disowned. Her entire life, all she had known, could be wiped away in an instant if she chose to follow her heart. But her love for David was stronger than her fear. She looked her father in the eye, her heart thundering in her chest, and made the decision that would alter her life forever. "I choose David," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a quiet defiance. "I choose love." Victor's face contorted in fury, his fists clenching. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Then go," he spat. "Go, and never return." Lily's chest tightened, the pain of her father's rejection sharp and deep. But she held her ground. She would not let him break her, not this time. She turned toward the door, her heart heavy but her resolve clear. As she stepped out of the grand dining room and into the hallway, she knew she was walking away from everything she had ever known. But in that moment, she also knew she was walking toward something infinitely more precious, her own happiness, her own future. And as the door of the Hartford estate closed behind her, Lily made a silent vow to herself. She would not let fear stop her. She would build her life on her own terms, with David by her side. The choice had been made. There was no turning back now. Lily stood at the threshold of the Hartford estate, the sprawling mansion that had been her home for as long as she could remember. The grandeur that had once been a symbol of security now felt cold and distant. Behind her, the echoes of her father's harsh words reverberated in her mind, but she refused to let them break her resolve. She had made her choice. David, the man who had shown her a love she had never known existed outside of fairy tales. The man whose hands, weathered by years of hard work, had held hers with tenderness and care. She had chosen him, not for his wealth, not for his station, but for the depth of his heart, which she had come to know and trust more than anything. Lily's eyes lingered on the ornate stone archway that marked the boundary between the world she was leaving behind and the uncertain future ahead. Her father's wealth, his mansion, his plans, they no longer mattered. She could already hear the distant hum of her new life calling to her. In the quiet fields of Maple Ridge, where the air was fresh and the skies wide and open, she glanced at the small suitcase at her feet, its contents a modest reflection of the life she had left behind. A few dresses, some simple clothes, and the locket her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. Her mother, the one person who had always encouraged her to follow her heart. Lily pressed the locket to her chest, closing her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the faint warmth of her mother's memory surrounding her. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie, and Lily turned to see David walking toward her. His familiar, reassuring presence was a balm to her nerves. David, with his rugged strength and quiet confidence, had always been a man of few words. But those few words, when spoken, held more weight than any grand declaration. His eyes, full of love and concern, met hers, and she could see the questions in them. "Are you sure about this?" His voice was soft, as if he were afraid the wrong words might shatter the moment. Lily nodded, her throat tight, but her heart clear. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." David reached out and took her hand, his grip steady and warm. There was no judgment in his touch, no hesitation. He simply accepted her decision as his own, knowing that this was not just her choice, but theirs. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would build something new, something real. "I'll be with you, Lily," David said, his words simple but sincere. "We'll make it work, no matter what." Lily felt a lump rise in her throat, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to lean into him, taking comfort in the strength of his arms. The life ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, no doubt, but in that moment, standing on the edge of a new beginning, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Together, they left the estate behind, stepping into the unknown. The journey to Maple Ridge was long and filled with a quiet kind of intensity. The drive was peaceful at first, with nothing but the hum of the car's engine and the soft whispers of the wind. But as the miles stretched on, the weight of what Lily had left behind began to settle in her chest. The Hartford estate had been her world, her comfort zone, her safety net. And now, she had nothing but the open road and the promise of a life with David. As they drove through winding country roads, past fields of golden wheat and sprawling farms, Lily couldn't help but feel the sharp contrast between the world she was leaving and the one she was about to enter. The simple, quiet beauty of the land was a stark reminder of everything she had given up. She had always imagined that a life of wealth would bring happiness, that luxury would fill the void she felt in her soul. But now, as she looked out at the open fields, she realized how wrong she had been. It wasn't wealth that had the power to make her heart whole. it was love. David's steady presence beside her gave her the strength to push forward, even when doubts crept into her mind. What would the future hold? Would they truly be able to make a life together, far from the opulence she had known? Would she ever be able to face her father again, knowing the pain she had caused him? But David, always in tune with her thoughts, reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Lily knew there was no going back. Whatever happened, they would face it together. When they finally arrived at Maple Ridge, Lily was taken aback by the sheer simplicity of the place. The small town, with its unpretentious homes and narrow streets, felt worlds away from the polished marble floors and grand chandeliers of the Hartford estate. But there was a warmth to the place, a quiet charm that made Lily feel welcome, even though she was a stranger in this new world. David's farm was nestled on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by wide-open fields and a few scattered barns. The air smelled of fresh hay and earth, a scent so different from the sterile, expensive perfume of the Hartford estate. The house was modest, a small cottage with a tin roof and ivy creeping up the walls. But to Lily, it felt like a haven, a place where she could finally breathe freely. David led her inside, showing her the modest kitchen and the cozy living room. It was nothing like the grand rooms of her former home, but Lily felt an inexplicable sense of comfort in the space. There were no lavish decorations, no priceless paintings hanging on the walls. Instead, there were warm, wooden beams and the simple beauty of hand-carved furniture. It was a home, a place where life was real and unvarnished. As David showed her around, Lily's heart swelled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was her new reality now. There were no fancy parties, no designer dresses, no sparkling jewels. It was just her, David, and the promise of a life they would build together from the ground up. "Do you like it?" David asked, his voice gentle, as he waited for her to speak. Lily smiled, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and anticipation. "It's perfect," she said. "It's more than perfect." David's smile was slow, warm, and full of affection. "We'll make it work, Lily. I promise you." And in that moment, Lily knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Back at the Hartford estate, Victor paced through the grand halls, his footsteps echoing like the ticking of a clock, marking his dwindling patience. The house, once vibrant with the sounds of laughter, music, and bustling servants, now felt hollow. Lily was gone, and it was as if the life had been drained from the very walls. He could still see her face in his mind, the stubbornness in her eyes, the way she stood her ground when she had made that impossible choice. David, that farmer, had stolen her heart, and now his daughter had abandoned everything he had worked so hard to build for her. Victor stopped by the massive window that overlooked the manicured gardens, the vast expanse of land that stretched far beyond the estate's borders. He gazed out at the carefully curated landscape, the green lawns and towering oak trees, the epitome of everything he had accomplished in his life. And yet, there was no satisfaction in the view. His daughter, his only child, was gone, and no amount of wealth or status could fill the void her absence had created. He had given her everything, every opportunity, every luxury, every resource, except the one thing that mattered most: his love, the kind of love that demanded conformity, obedience, and unquestioning devotion to his vision. The kind of love that could never accept a choice that diverged from the path he had so meticulously planned for her. He sank into a chair by the window, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him like an unrelenting storm. His mind swirled with confusion and rage, but beneath it all, a deeper feeling began to emerge. Something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Regret? Victor's mind wandered back to their years together, the memories of his daughter as a little girl, her laugh echoing through the halls of the estate, her wide-eyed wonder at the world. He had promised her the world, but somewhere along the way, he had lost her. Somewhere along the way, he had chosen the world over her. He took a deep breath and stood, walking toward the decanter of whiskey on the sideboard. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal before he took a deep, desperate gulp. The burn of the alcohol, did nothing to quell the gnawing pain in his chest. "Why did you have to leave?" he muttered to the empty room, as if the walls might answer him. Victor's pride had always been his armor, but it was beginning to crack. His anger toward Lily's defiance was still strong, but there was something else now, something he couldn't name. A flicker of understanding, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply loneliness. He had always believed that his daughter would return to him when she realized the mistake she had made, that she would come to her senses and see the truth of his world. But what if she never did? What if she had truly chosen that man, that farmer, over her own father? His thoughts turned to the future, his future, now that Lily had left. The business deals, the meetings, the events that had once filled his calendar with promises of power and prestige suddenly felt irrelevant. The empire he had built seemed hollow without his daughter by his side. He had planned for everything, but now, in the quiet aftermath of her departure, he realized how little he had actually prepared for the loss of her love. For the first time in years, Victor felt vulnerable. Far away from the sprawling estate, Lily settled into the simplicity of farm life. The first few days on David's farm had been a whirlwind of adjustment, her hands unfamiliar with the tools and chores of the land. The quiet of the countryside was a stark contrast to the constant hum of activity at Hartford, but the change was both soothing and unsettling. She missed the convenience of her old life, the servants, the high society events, the luxury of simply being able to slip into any role she was required to play. But as the days wore on, she found herself learning the rhythm of the farm. There was something almost meditative in the steady routine of work, feeding the animals, tending to the crops, mending the fences. The land, though demanding, provided a sense of purpose that was absent from her life in Hartford. It was a different kind of work, grounded, tangible, and fulfilling in ways she hadn't expected. David was by her side, patient and steady. He never once made her feel inadequate for not knowing how to milk a cow or tend to the vegetable garden. He had a way of guiding her, teaching her without making her feel foolish. His quiet support was a balm to her wounded heart. Yet, despite the tranquility of her new life, the shadow of her father's rejection hung over her. There were moments, late at night when the world outside was still, that she found herself wondering whether she had done the right thing. She had chosen David, yes, but at what cost? She had given up her place in the world, the family she had always known, the future her father had planned for her. And while David's love was more than she could have ever asked for, the weight of her father's decision, the finality of it, was heavy on her soul. "I know it's not easy," David said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon. "But we'll make it work. You'll see. We'll build a life here, together." Lily nodded, her throat tight. "I hope so," she whispered, though doubt lingered in her voice. "But I can't help wondering if I made a mistake. I miss the old life sometimes. The familiar things. The people." David reached out, his hand covering hers, warm and steady. "You made the right choice," he said softly, his voice unshaken. "You chose love, and that's what matters." Lily swallowed, squeezing his hand in return. She wanted to believe him, needed to, but deep down, she couldn't erase the ache of her father's rejection. He had disowned her. She was no longer his daughter in his eyes. And for all her love for David, the sting of her father's loss was still fresh. But as the days turned to weeks, Lily began to realize something. Her love for David wasn't a mistake. It was a choice she would make again and again, no matter the cost. They had something real, something that couldn't be measured by wealth or status. It was a connection built on trust, understanding, and an unwavering belief in each other. In the end, that was all she needed. As the cool autumn breeze swept across the fields, Lily knew that the road ahead would not be without its struggles, but she also knew that with David by her side, she would face whatever came with a heart full of hope. And so, she let go of the doubt, allowing herself to embrace the love that was waiting for her, here, in the life she had chosen. The months passed in a blur of hard work, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of farm life. It wasn't always easy. There were days when Lily's hands ached from the work, her muscles protesting the unfamiliar tasks of tending the land. But with each passing day, she grew stronger, both in body and spirit. The early mornings became a welcome ritual, the fresh country air filling her lungs as she worked alongside David, planting seeds, tending to the animals, and learning the intricacies of the land. Though the labor was grueling at times, there was a peace here that Lily had never known in the bustling halls of Hartford. The simplicity of it, the way the seasons turned, each day following the one before it, with nothing to complicate the routine, allowed her to clear her mind. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, Lily would sit on the porch with David, sipping tea, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. Still, there were moments when her past life would come crashing back, as if she were caught in the weight of her own history. Late at night, when she lay awake in the small room she shared with David, memories of her father would come to her unbidden. She would think of the grand dinners, the opulent events, and the weight of her father's expectations pressing down on her. And then there was the emptiness, the hollow ache of being disowned, of knowing that her father would never speak to her again, that she would never walk through the grand halls of Hartford with his approval in her heart. But each time those thoughts threatened to overtake her, David's steady presence brought her back. He was her anchor, her refuge. His love was unwavering, and he never made her feel like she was lacking or lost. In his eyes, Lily saw not just the woman she was, but the woman she was becoming. And that woman was strong, confident, and more at peace than she had ever been before. One evening, as they worked together in the garden, David paused and looked at her with a warmth that melted her heart. "You've come a long way, Lily," he said softly, his voice laced with admiration. "You've grown into someone incredible." Lily looked up at him, her eyes full of emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice thick with gratitude. "You've helped me find parts of myself I didn't even know were there." David smiled, taking her hand in his. "We've built something real here, together." The words were simple, but they held more meaning than anything she had ever heard before. This wasn't just a life she was building with David. It was a new beginning, a life grounded in love, work, and trust. It was a life free from the constraints of her past, where she could breathe freely and be true to herself. And for the first time, Lily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But even as she embraced her new life, Lily couldn't entirely escape the remnants of her past. Her father's absence loomed over her, a shadow that crept into her thoughts when she least expected it. Every now and then, she would hear whispers from town, gossip about the once prominent Hartford family, the coldness that had followed her father's rejection of her. The whispers weren't cruel, but they stung nonetheless. People in Maple Ridge were kind, but there was always a curiosity about her, a distance that was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as Lily was sorting through a basket of freshly picked vegetables, she felt the familiar tension in the air, a sense of something unsaid. David was standing by the barn, watching her intently, his brow furrowed. There was something different in the way he looked at her, something unspoken that hung between them. Lily set the basket down, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, David?" she asked gently, knowing that something was on his mind. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's nothing really," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice told her otherwise. "Tell me," she insisted, walking over to him. "You know you can always talk to me." David took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. "I've been thinking about your father," he admitted quietly, "and about what happened, about the way he treated you." Lily's heart clenched at the mention of her father, but she held her ground. She had never talked about him with David, not in any real way. Her decision to leave Hartford had been made, and she had buried the pain of her father's rejection deep inside. But now, standing before David, she realized that she hadn't truly processed the hurt. She hadn't allowed herself to grieve the loss of a father she had once admired, who had once been everything to her. "He doesn't understand, David," Lily said, her voice breaking as she spoke. "He's always cared more about his empire than about me. He's never seen me for who I am, only for what he wanted me to be." David reached out, placing his hand on hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "I know, Lily. I know. But you don't have to carry that weight alone anymore. You have me. And whatever happens, we'll face it together. Lily nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I thought I could forget him, move on from the hurt. But it's harder than I thought. David pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close as if to shield her from the storm of emotions threatening to overtake her. For a long moment, they stood there, the wind rustling the leaves above them, the quiet hum of the farm a soothing contrast to the turmoil inside Lily's heart. I don't need him anymore, she whispered, more to herself than to David. I don't need his approval. I've got you, and that's all that matters now. David's voice was firm, filled with the certainty of someone who had already chosen his path. And I've got you, Lily. Always. For the first time in a long while, Lily allowed herself to lean fully into the warmth of David's embrace, letting the love between them fill the cracks her father's absence had left behind. In that moment, she knew that she had made the right choice. She was exactly where she needed to be. The next day, Lily received a letter, unexpected, and from none other than her father. Her hand trembled as she held the envelope, the handwriting unmistakable, even after all this time. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she left Hartford, and the thought of hearing from him now filled her with a mixture of dread and curiosity. David watched her with a knowing look, his hand resting on her shoulder as she carefully opened the letter. As she read the words, her heart sank, then skipped a beat. Lily stood motionless, the letter clutched in her hand as she read her father's words. Each sentence felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, and she had to read them more than once to fully comprehend their meaning. Lily, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I have thought long and hard about the choices you've made, and while I may never fully understand them, I wish to say this. I regret how things have ended between us. Your absence has been a constant reminder of the mistakes I've made in my life. I am not proud of my actions, and I would like to make amends if you are willing to hear me out. Perhaps one day, we could talk. Your father. The words were neither an apology nor a reconciliation, but the undertone of regret was unmistakable. Her father's cold pride had always held him at arm's length from real emotion, and even now, he struggled to express the vulnerability she had longed for. Yet, the acknowledgement of his regret stirred something within Lily, something she had buried deep inside her heart, hope. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket, the heaviness of it lingering in her thoughts. David watched her closely, sensing the storm brewing within her. What does he say? He asked softly, his tone gentle, giving her the space to process it on her own terms. Lily looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the conflict within her. He regrets it, she murmured, more to herself than to him. He says he regrets how things ended between us. But it's not an apology. It's just him trying to make things right in his own way. David didn't say anything for a moment, letting her words settle in the silence. Do you think he's sincere? He asked carefully, not wanting to push her but unable to ignore the uncertainty in her voice. Lily didn't answer immediately. She had spent years in the shadow of her father's expectations, trying to live up to his impossible standards. And now, his words, though they were an acknowledgement of regret, felt like nothing more than a fragile attempt to reclaim what he had lost. She had walked away from his world because she couldn't bear to be a part of it any longer. His wealth, his power, the empire he had built, it had all come at the cost of their relationship. But in that moment, as she stood in David's embrace, she realized that she no longer craved her father's approval. She had found something more valuable in the love she shared with David: honesty, respect, and a life built on trust. And yet, the letter had stirred a part of her she hadn't fully recognized, the part that still yearned for her father's love, despite everything. I don't know, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know if he's sincere, David, but I can't ignore what he said. It feels like a crack in the wall between us, a crack I've never seen before. David's hands rested on her shoulders, his touch grounding her. It's okay to be conflicted, he said softly. You don't have to decide anything right now. You've made your choice, Lily. You've built a life here with me. Whatever happens with your father, we'll face it together. Lily nodded, grateful for his steady support. I know, she whispered. I just don't know what to do with this letter. It's like he's trying to reach out, but I don't know if I can let him in again." David kissed her forehead, his lips lingering for a moment. "You don't have to let him in if you're not ready. But if you ever want to, I'll be here." Lily felt the weight of his words, and for the first time since receiving the letter, she felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about forgiving her father or letting him back into her life just because he regretted his actions. It was about giving herself the space to heal, to decide what kind of relationship she wanted with him, if any. And right now, she wasn't sure. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension as Lily wrestled with the letter and the emotions it stirred within her. David gave her the time she needed, never once pushing her to make a decision. He knew that the road to healing was a long one, and that Lily had to navigate it in her own way. Meanwhile, Victor found himself struggling with the weight of his own decisions. The mansion, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. He walked through its vast halls, the emptiness echoing around him. The rooms that had once been filled with laughter and the bustle of servants now seemed hollow, devoid of life. His thoughts were consumed by Lily's departure, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted. "I did it all for her," he thought bitterly. "I built this empire for her, and she chose him over me, over everything I've worked for." But deep down, Victor knew that it wasn't about the empire. It wasn't about the wealth or the power. It was about his pride, his unwillingness to bend for the one person who had ever truly mattered to him. And now, that pride had cost him everything. Victor sat in his study, staring at the letter he had written to Lily. His words were measured, carefully crafted to sound sincere, but part of him wondered if she would even read them. Would she? Would she be willing to let him back into her life? After everything he had done? He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the years between them. The years he had spent pushing her away without even realizing it. He had thought that wealth and status were the measures of success, but now he saw how misguided he had been. "I've lost her," he thought, his hand trembling as he set the letter aside. "And now I don't know how to fix it." But as the days wore on, something inside Victor shifted. The anger, the bitterness, the pride, they all began to crack. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could do something to begin the process of healing. He wasn't sure what that something was yet, but the very thought of it kept him awake at night. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Lily's life continued to unfold. She was beginning to embrace the idea that perhaps healing didn't mean going back to the way things were. Maybe it meant letting go of the past altogether, finding peace in the life she had chosen, with David by her side. But as the seasons changed and the harvest drew near, one question lingered in the back of her mind. Would she ever hear from her father again? And if she did, would it be enough to heal the wounds he had caused? Or would it only reopen the scars that had yet to fade? The cool autumn breeze rustled through the trees surrounding the farm, and Lily stood at the porch, the letter from her father still in her hand. She had spent hours staring at it, turning it over in her mind, reading it again and again. A part of her had hoped that his words would give her the clarity she so desperately needed. But now that they were written, she found herself still uncertain, torn between the daughter she had been and the woman she had become. She had decided not to make any immediate decisions about the letter. Instead, she had buried herself in work, throwing herself into the harvest season. The farm, with its challenges and small victories, provided a steady rhythm to her days. The quiet moments with David were a balm to her soul. Yet, the letter remained like a shadow in the back of her mind, pulling at her heart when she least expected it. One evening, as she and David sat by the fire, Lily spoke the words she had been keeping inside. "I think I need to write him back," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've spent so much time trying to forget him, trying to prove to myself that I didn't need him, but I can't pretend it doesn't matter anymore." His letter, it meant something. David, who had always been patient with her, nodded slowly. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Lily," he said softly, his eyes reflecting the care he had for her. "But if you think this is what you need, I'll support you. Always." Lily looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. The fear of rejection, of reopening old wounds, still clung to her. But David's unwavering faith in her gave her the courage to move forward. Perhaps it was time to let go of the anger, to allow herself to be vulnerable once more, even if it meant facing the pain of her past. With a deep breath, Lily rose from her chair and went inside, her heart pounding as she pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She thought for a long time, her mind filled with memories of her father, memories both sweet and bitter. She had loved him once, had believed in him with all her heart, but now the love she felt was a strange mix of longing and sadness. The realization hit her with full force. She had never truly known him, not as the father she had always hoped he would be. Taking the pen in hand, Lily began to write. Father, I don't know where to begin. I've thought about this letter for days, maybe longer, trying to find the right words. The truth is, I don't know if I have the right words at all, but I owe it to myself to say something, to at least try. I've spent so much of my life seeking your approval, chasing the dream of becoming the person you wanted me to be. I thought that if I could do that, if I could be perfect enough for you, that maybe, just maybe, you would see me, the real me. But I know now that it was never about me, not really. It was about what you wanted me to be, what you needed me to be. When I left, I thought I was leaving behind a life that had suffocated me, a life that was not mine. And maybe I was. But it wasn't easy. I thought of you every day, wondered if I had made the wrong choice. But now I know. What I left behind was not the person I needed to be. I needed to be someone who chose love over all else, even if it meant walking away from everything I had known. I needed to choose Michael, to choose a life that was real and simple and full of love. I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect you to change or to apologize. But I do hope that, in time, you can see that I made the right decision. I've found peace here, a peace I didn't think was possible. And while it hasn't been easy, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. If you ever want to talk, I will be here. But know this, I am no longer the person I was when I left. I am someone new, someone who has found her own way. And for the first time, I'm proud of the woman I am. Lily. Lily read the letter over several times, her heart both heavy and light at once. It was everything she had wanted to say but had been too afraid to admit, even to herself. She didn't know if her father would ever read it, or if he would even respond. But she had to do this for herself. She had to find closure, even if it meant opening the door to a relationship that might never fully heal. With a final, shaky breath, she folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. As she set it down on the table, David came to stand beside her. "You're doing the right thing," he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. "No matter what happens, you've taken a step toward healing." Lily nodded, feeling both relief and anxiety settle within her. "I hope so. I hope it's the right step." David kissed her forehead, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I'll be here, no matter what, and I believe in you." The next day, Lily took the letter to the post office. As she handed it to the clerk, a sense of finality washed over her. There was no turning back now. Her father would either read her words, or he wouldn't. She couldn't control that. What she could control was the choice she had made to speak her truth, to finally put her past to rest, no matter how difficult it might be. As the letter disappeared into the postal system, Lily returned to the farm, to the life she had built with David. She had done what she needed to do. The rest was beyond her control. For the first time in a long time, she felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever came next, whether it was from her father or from life itself, she would face it with the strength she had found within herself. The love she shared with David was her anchor, and together, they could weather any storm. As the days went by, Lily threw herself back into her work, but a small part of her waited, hoping against hope for some kind of response. Yet, no matter what happened next, she knew she had done all she could. The rest was out of her hands. And so, life went on, with each passing day adding new layers to the story of the woman who had once been a daughter, a woman who had chosen love over legacy, and who was now learning how to live on her own terms. The letter had been sent, and now, Lily could do nothing but wait. The days passed in a blur of routines on the farm. The harvest was plentiful, and there was a rhythm to her life with Michael that felt comforting, though never without its challenges. But in the quiet moments, When the chores were done and the sky faded to the warm hues of sunset, her thoughts often drifted back to her father's letter. Had it made any difference? Had it reached him at all? Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore sat in his opulent study, staring out the window at the sprawling grounds of his estate. The grandeur of his mansion, the wealth that he had spent a lifetime accumulating, felt empty now. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Lily, thoughts that would not let him go. The letter she had sent had stirred something deep within him, something he had buried under layers of pride, control, and ambition. For the first time in years, he felt a deep pang of regret that he couldn't shake. For days, he had struggled with the weight of his own emotions. He had told himself that he had made the right choice when he forced Lily to choose between his world and the life she wanted. After all, he had only wanted what was best for her. But now, the cold emptiness of the mansion mocked him. The silence in the halls screamed louder than the bustling social gatherings he used to host. The idea of his daughter, the daughter he had raised with such high expectations, living far away on a humble farm, filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. Richard had always believed that wealth, success, and status were the things that made life meaningful. He had worked tirelessly to build his empire, and he had expected Lily to follow in his footsteps. But now, as he sat alone in his study, the weight of his own decisions pressed down on him. His wealth could not bring him the satisfaction he had once believed it would. And Lily, his only daughter, was gone, living a life that, to him, seemed beneath her. But why did it hurt so much? Why did he feel so empty without her? He paced back and forth in his study, his thoughts spiraling. I should have never let her go, he thought bitterly. I should have done things differently. I should have been there for her, not pushed her away. His anger and pride fought against his regret, but they were no match for the realization that he had failed her. In that moment, Richard knew he couldn't keep living this way. If he didn't do something, he might lose her forever. The decision came as a shock to him. He would go to her. At first, the thought had seemed impossible. His world, his carefully constructed empire, had always been a fortress. To leave it behind, even for a day, felt like an affront to everything he had built. But the realization that his pride had cost him his daughter was more painful than anything else he had ever experienced. If there was even the slightest chance of reconciliation, he had to try. Richard's journey to Willow Creek was long and uneventful. He drove in silence, the hum of the car engine the only sound in the vast, empty space of his thoughts. He had no idea what to expect when he arrived, no idea how to approach Lily or Michael, but he couldn't stay locked in his own regret forever. This was a step he had to take, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The drive was slow, as if the world was forcing him to confront every moment of his life that had led him to this point. The grand cities he had once dominated seemed far away now. The lush green fields of Willow Creek, though beautiful in their own way, felt alien to him. It was a world of simplicity, of quiet lives lived without the constant hustle and competition of the city. For a man like Richard, it was unsettling. As he approached the farm, his heart began to race. What would he find there? Would Lily welcome him, or would she turn him away in anger? Would Michael even allow him to speak to her? The questions bounced around in his mind like stones in a jar, impossible to silence. He finally pulled up to the farmhouse, a modest structure that stood in stark contrast to the cold, imposing mansion he had left behind. There were no grand gates, no manicured gardens, just a simple home surrounded by fields of green. It looked so real, so different from everything he had known. Richard hesitated before getting out of the car. The mansion had always been his refuge, his place of control. But here, on this farm, he was an outsider. He was just a man who had come to try and mend a broken relationship. And for the first time in years, Richard felt vulnerable. He made his way to the front door and knocked. Lily had been working in the garden when she heard the knock. It was a sound she wasn't used to, not in the stillness of the afternoon. She wiped her hands on her apron, wondering who it could be. As she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her was her father, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the porch. He looked different, smaller, somehow, than the man she remembered. His usual air of arrogance had been replaced with something more fragile. His eyes, usually hard and calculating, were filled with something unfamiliar: vulnerability. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily's heart raced as she took in the sight of him. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to say. Her emotions, so carefully guarded, threatened to overwhelm her. "Lily," Richard finally said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to come. I need to see you. I need to try and understand everything." Lily didn't know how to respond. A part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to turn her back on the man who had forced her to make impossible choices. But another part of her, the part she had spent so many years trying to suppress, wanted to reach out, to hear him, to see if there was any chance for them to heal. After a long silence, Lily stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Come in, Father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can talk." As Richard crossed the threshold, he looked around, taking in the modest home that had become Lily's sanctuary. There was no grandeur here, no polished marble or gilded mirrors, just the simple warmth of a home that had been built with love. Richard followed Lily inside, his heart heavy with the weight of all the words he had never said. This was it. This was the moment where he would either bridge the gap between them or lose her forever. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to try. As Richard stepped into the modest farmhouse, he was met by an unexpected warmth. The simple decor, the smells of fresh bread, and the soft hum of life on the farm were a far cry from the cold, calculated luxury he had always known. For a moment, he felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't his own. But Lily didn't push him away. Instead, she led him into the small living room where a fire crackled in the hearth, the soft glow casting long shadows across the room. "Please, sit down," Lily said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a swirl of emotions. She gestured to a worn armchair beside the fireplace. Richard sat down slowly, his posture rigid, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. This wasn't how he had imagined it. He had thought of confronting Lily, of asserting his position as her father and guiding her back to the world he believed was best for her. But now, as he sat here in this humble home, all his old certainties seemed so distant, so irrelevant. Lily sat across from him, her gaze never leaving his face. She had changed. He could see that now. She was no longer the young woman he had tried to control, the daughter who had once looked up to him with a mixture of awe and fear. She was strong, grounded, and something inside him stirred, a mixture of pride and regret. After a long silence, Richard spoke, his voice low. "I don't know where to begin." Lily looked at him, her expression guarded. "Start with why you came," she said softly, her words simple but cutting. "What made you change your mind after all this time?" Richard's jaw tightened. It was harder than he had imagined, harder than he had anticipated. The words he had rehearsed so many times in his head felt inadequate now. How could he explain the years of pride, the constant need to control, and the sudden, painful realization that he had lost the one thing that truly mattered, his daughter? I've spent so much time trying to make sure everything in my life was perfect. I thought that if I could control it all, my business, my wealth, my family, then I could secure a future for you. I thought that was what you wanted, what you needed." Richard's voice faltered, and for the first time in years, he felt a wave of vulnerability. "But when I got your letter, something inside me broke. It was like I had built this fortress around myself, but the walls came crashing down the moment I realized what I had lost. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't." Lily listened intently, her heart both hardened and softened by his words. She had always known her father's drive, his relentless pursuit of success. But hearing him admit his failures, his regrets, in such a raw, unguarded way was a different experience altogether. "Why now?" she asked quietly, her voice betraying the hurt that had remained buried for so long. "Why didn't you try to reach out sooner, when I was still at home, when I needed you?" Richard's eyes dropped to the floor, guilt washing over him. "I thought I knew what was best for you. I was too blinded by my own pride, by my own fears, to see that I was losing you. I thought you would come back, that you would eventually see that the life I offered was the right one for you." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I see now that I was wrong. I was wrong to force you into a choice. I was wrong to not see you for who you really were, someone capable of making her own decisions, of building a life on her own terms." Lily studied him for a long moment, her mind racing. She had wanted to hear these words, had longed for him to admit that he had been wrong. But hearing them now, in the flesh, stirred emotions she had buried for years. She had always wanted her father to see her, to accept her, but she hadn't known how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "You always wanted me to follow your path," Lily said, her voice trembling slightly. "You never let me choose for myself. You wanted to shape me into someone I wasn't. And I hated that. I hated that I had to make myself small in order to fit into the life you envisioned for me. I didn't know how to be anything else," Richard confessed, his voice thick with regret. "I thought that the only way to protect you, to ensure your future, was to control it. I didn't understand that love isn't about control. It's about letting go." Lily's eyes softened at his words. There was a quiet, fragile truth in what he was saying, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe they could rebuild their relationship, slowly, cautiously, but with the possibility of healing. "Do you want to see him?" Lily asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced at the thought of what was to come. "Michael?" Richard asked, his voice uncertain, as though the very mention of his name unsettled him. "You're with him now. I suppose I should meet him?" Lily nodded, standing up from her seat. "I'll go get him." Richard watched her leave the room, his mind still reeling. What was he expecting from this encounter? What would Michael think of him? He was a wealthy, powerful man, out of place in this humble home, among people who had built their lives from the ground up. And yet, there was a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. Lily returned a few moments later with Michael by her side. Michael was taller than Richard remembered, his broad shoulders carrying the strength of someone who worked the land. His face was kind, though there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. He didn't seem fazed by Richard's presence, but Richard could see the wariness in his eyes. "Father, this is Michael," Lily said simply, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "Michael, this is my father." Michael extended a hand, and Richard took it reluctantly, his grip firm but cautious. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Richard felt like an outsider, like a trespasser in a world he didn't understand. "I've heard a lot about you," Michael said, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it. "But I think we have a lot to talk about." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I don't expect anything from you, Michael. I only want to understand my daughter's choices, and maybe, just maybe, to make things right." Michael studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I don't know if you can ever make things right, Mr. Whitmore, but if you're truly here to understand, then maybe we can start from there." The tension in the room hung heavy, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt the weight of his past actions shift. This wasn't just about making amends. It was about learning to see the world through Lily's eyes, about accepting her choices, no matter how different they were from the life he had imagined for her. As the conversation unfolded, Richard slowly began to realize that the path to redemption was not a straight one. It was fraught with mistakes, misunderstandings, and painful truths. But it was a path he was willing to walk, if only to earn back the love he had lost. The days following Richard's first visit to the farm passed with a quiet intensity. At first, it was awkward, each moment punctuated by silences and tentative words. But as time wore on, something shifted between Richard, Lily, and Michael. Richard found himself waking early, helping with chores on the farm. It was grueling work, nothing like the clean-cut business meetings and polished boardrooms he was used to, but there was something grounding about it. Each task, no matter how small, seemed to chip away at the fortress of pride he had built around himself. Lily, for her part, observed her father from a distance, her heart a tangled mess of old wounds and cautious hope. She had never imagined her father would be capable of such humility. She had spent so many years angry at him, resenting the life he had tried to impose on her, that she had never given him the chance to prove he could change. But here he was, carrying bales of hay, learning the rhythms of farm life, his hands rough and calloused from the hard labor. She couldn't deny the small flickers of something resembling respect that were beginning to form. One evening, after a long day of work, Richard sat beside Lily and Michael on the porch, the golden hues of sunset casting a warm glow over the farm. The air was thick with the scent of earth and fresh grass, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the space between them. "You've been here for a week now," Lily said, breaking the silence. "And you're still here." Richard looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've never worked this hard in my life," he admitted, his voice quiet. "It's not easy, but I've come to understand that hard work isn't something to be ashamed of. It's necessary." Michael nodded, his hands resting on his knees. "It's the backbone of everything. People don't realize how much it takes to build something real, something lasting. It's not just about the money or the connections. It's about putting in the effort day after day." Richard sat back, taking in the simplicity of it all. It had been so long since he had done anything that wasn't about acquiring wealth or status. He had spent years building an empire, but in the process, he had lost sight of what really mattered. The lessons here were harder to learn than any financial strategy he had ever studied, but they were more important. For the first time in his life, Richard felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for his wealth, but for this experience. The farm, the people, the life his daughter had chosen. They had forced him to reckon with the parts of himself he had buried. And though he still struggled with his pride, he could no longer deny the truth that had been staring him in the face all along. Success was about more than money. It was about love, integrity, and the courage to live authentically. As the evening wore on, they shared a quiet dinner at the small kitchen table. The meal was simple: roast chicken, vegetables from the garden, and freshly baked bread. But it felt like the most nourishing meal Richard had had in years. There was no pretense, no luxury, just real food, shared with real people. After dinner, Richard excused himself and walked outside, feeling the cool night air on his face. The sky was clear, dotted with 1,000 stars. He stood there for a moment, letting the vastness of the world wash over him, realizing how small and insignificant his previous worries had seemed in the grand scheme of things. He had spent so many years chasing after things that had ultimately left him feeling empty. But here, on this farm, surrounded by his daughter and the man she had chosen to build a life with, he was starting to see a different kind of wealth. The next day, Richard continued to work alongside Michael and Lily. They planted seeds, repaired fences, and tended to the animals. It was exhausting work, but there was something fulfilling about it that Richard had never known. His body ached in ways he had never experienced, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. He wasn't just working for a paycheck or for recognition. He was working for something real, something tangible. That afternoon, as they took a break by the creek, Richard sat down beside Lily, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "You've changed, Dad," Lily said, her voice softer than it had been when they first met. "I've had a lot of time to think," Richard replied, "about everything I've done and everything I've failed to do." Lily turned to face him, studying his face as though searching for something, some sign that his words were true. "And what have you learned?" Richard let out a breath, feeling the weight of his realization settle into his chest. "I've learned that love doesn't come with conditions. I've spent my whole life thinking that if I could control everything, if I could shape things just so, I could keep the people I loved safe. But I was wrong. I was wrong to try and control you, to try and shape your life into what I thought was best. I see that now. And I'm sorry, Lily. I'm sorry for everything." Lily blinked, surprised by the rawness of his apology. She had spent so many years angry at him, so many years carrying the weight of his expectations and his decisions. And hearing him admit his mistakes, truly admit them, was both painful and healing at the same time. "It's not easy," Lily said, her voice quiet, "but I can see that you're trying. And that means something." Richard nodded, his throat tight. He hadn't expected forgiveness, But hearing her words, even the smallest bit of understanding, felt like a step forward. A fragile one, but a step nonetheless. I want to be part of your life, Lily. I don't know if I can ever make up for all the time I lost, but I want to be here to support you, to be the father you deserve. Lily smiled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. I think that's all any of us can ask for. We're all just doing the best we can. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Richard finally felt a sense of peace. He wasn't there yet, not by a long shot. There would be more difficult conversations, more hard lessons to learn, and more mistakes to make. But for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his old world lifting, replaced by something more real, more lasting. In that moment, as he sat beside Lily and Michael, he realized that the true promise of change wasn't about fixing everything in one grand gesture. It was about showing up, day after day, and being willing to try. And for the first time, he was ready to try. The days that followed Richard's heartfelt conversation with Lily were quiet, filled with the steady rhythm of farm life. There was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just the soft hum of nature and the quiet work that made everything run smoothly. For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of connection, not just to his daughter, but to the world around him. He had spent so much of his life chasing wealth, power, and control, but now he was beginning to understand that these things were empty without the foundation of love, respect, and human connection. Each day, Richard worked beside Michael and Lily, learning the nuances of farm life that had once seemed foreign to him. He repaired fences, dug new irrigation trenches, and helped harvest crops, finding joy in the simplicity of the tasks. It was nothing like the luxurious world he had known, but it was real, so much more real than the cold marble floors and polished boardrooms of his past. One morning, as Richard walked out into the fields with Michael to check on the crops, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. A month ago, he had been a man ruled by his pride and fear, convinced that his wealth and influence were the only things that mattered. Now, here he was, standing under the open sky, working alongside the people who mattered most in his life. "How's it looking?" Richard asked, wiping sweat from his brow as he squinted at the rows of corn stretching out before them. Michael glanced over at him, his face a picture of quiet satisfaction. "It's coming along well. A little more care, and we'll have a good harvest." Richard nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment in the simple task. He had never known the value of patience and hard work like this before. But now, as he stood in the fields, he saw it clearly. The life he had tried to control, the future he had planned for his daughter, had been built on a foundation of selfishness. But now, he was learning that the true foundation of life was built on trust, understanding, and love. Later that afternoon, after a long day's work, Richard found himself sitting at the porch with Lily and Michael. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden light across the land, and for the first time, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. He had never imagined he could feel this way after everything that had happened between him and his daughter. "Lily," Richard said, his voice low and steady, "I know I can't undo the past, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm here for you, for Michael, for this life you've chosen. And I'll keep showing up, even if it takes time. Because this is real. This is what matters." Lily, sitting beside him, looked out across the fields, her face soft with the weight of their conversation. For so long, she had held onto the bitterness of their fractured relationship, believing that the rift between them was too deep to ever heal. But now, as she looked at her father, she saw something she had never seen before. Genuine remorse, a willingness to change, and a desire to understand. "I don't know if I can ever fully forget the hurt, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I can see that you're trying. And that's all I can ask for. We're all just trying to figure things out, aren't we?" Richard smiled faintly, the weight of his years of mistakes pressing on him, but also lifting as he realized that Lily was right. Life wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, about being open to change, and about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard. "I know it won't be easy," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm willing to take it one step at a time. And I hope that one day, we can find a way to heal all the wounds I caused. Lily looked over at him, her gaze softening. One step at a time, she repeated, nodding. That's all any of us can do. As the evening wore on, they sat together in the warm glow of the sunset, the world around them peaceful and still. The life Richard had once thought was beneath him, the life of a farmer, a simple existence far removed from the world he had ruled, was now the life he had come to cherish. He had once believed that money and power could provide everything, but now he knew the truth. True wealth lay in the connections we built with others, in the love we gave and received, and in the way we chose to live our lives. In the weeks that followed, Richard continued to work on the farm, slowly rebuilding his relationship with Lily and Michael. There were moments of doubt, moments when Richard's old habits of control and pride threatened to surface, but each time, he pushed them back, reminded of the life he had chosen to embrace. He had learned that change was a slow and difficult process, but it was worth it, because in the end, it wasn't about what you had, but who you became. One day, as the harvest season approached and the farm began to show the fruits of their hard work, Richard stood beside Lily and Michael on the porch once more, watching the golden fields stretch out before them. The sun was setting, casting its last rays over the land, and Richard felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This life, this simple, honest life, was his now, and it was enough. We've come a long way, Richard said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. Lily smiled, her eyes meeting his. Yes, we have, and we'll keep going. In that moment, Richard understood that the future was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they would face it together. The bond between father and daughter had been tested and strained, but now it was stronger than ever. And as the night fell, Richard knew that, though the road ahead might still have its challenges, he was finally on the right path. The story of their journey was just beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt ready for whatever came next. He was no longer a man ruled by pride or fear. He was simply a father, a man learning to love, and a man learning to be content with the life he had found. One that was real, grounded in the love and trust of those around him. And with that, a new chapter began. Years passed, and the seasons continued to turn on the farm. Richard, once a man consumed by the pursuit of wealth and power, had found something far more valuable than he had ever imagined. A sense of belonging, of purpose, and a deep, abiding love for the family he had nearly lost. He had learned that life wasn't about controlling every outcome or ensuring that everything fell into place according to his plan. It was about embracing the unpredictability, the imperfections, and the people who stood by you through it all. Lily and Michael's love had only grown stronger, and their farm flourished with each passing year. Richard was no longer just the father who had tried to impose his will on his daughter's life. He had become an integral part of their world, a man who understood the value of hard work, humility, and most importantly, unconditional love. He often found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset with Lily and Michael, his heart full of gratitude. He had never imagined this life for himself, yet it was the life that had brought him the most peace. There were still challenges ahead, and Richard knew that he would never fully escape the weight of his past mistakes. But he had made peace with who he was now. He wasn't perfect, but he was enough. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. As he looked over the land that had become his home, Richard realized that sometimes, the greatest successes weren't the ones that filled your pockets or elevated your status. Sometimes, the greatest successes were the quiet moments of connection, the willingness to change, and the courage to start over, no matter how many times it took. And so, Richard's story was no longer just one of a wealthy, proud man who had lost his way. It was the story of a father who had rediscovered the true meaning of life, a story of love, redemption, and a new beginning. As the stars began to twinkle above, Richard knew that, no matter what the future held, he had finally found his place in the world. And for the first time in a long time, he was content. Thank you so much for following along with this journey and for listening to the story until the very end. I truly appreciate your time and attention. If you enjoyed this tale, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world and helps bring more stories like this to life. Stay tuned for more, and I look forward to sharing more incredible adventures with you in the future.